Indeed, I'm William. I'm a researcher for the Kleros Cooperative. So if you're not familiar with Kleros, it's a blockchain-based dispute resolution platform. And I'm going to have sort of a more crypto economics mechanism design talk, where I talk about some of the research that we've done at Kleros to try to make Kleros resistant to certain kinds of attacks, called griefs, both sort of build on some of the general conclusions of this research, and have several examples, a couple of which come from Kleros. So to illustrate what a grief is, I'll start with a real-world example, and because Kleros is a dispute resolution platform, I'll use an example involving disputes. So in the real world, in traditional courts, traditional dispute resolution, it's sometimes possible to frivolously sue someone. So you can spend resources, lawyer fees, to force somebody else to defend themselves. You're imposing a cost upon yourself because you hire your own lawyers. But you're forcing this other side, your opponent, to defend themselves too, so that forces them to take on a cost. And this idea that I'm harming myself to harm somebody else, that's what we call a grief. And sometimes in some jurisdictions, maybe a judge at the end of the case will realize your dispute was frivolous and force you to pay the legal fees of your opponent. Maybe, maybe not, it depends on the case and the jurisdiction. And so why would anybody do this? Well, maybe they're your competitor, and they think they have a bigger budget for law fees than you do, so they're trying to drive you out of business. Maybe you live in a jurisdiction where you have some underlying case that has some payment at the end that you realize that morally you have to owe the other person, but you want to delay it because you think that whatever interest you might have to pay through the court will be less than the real interest rate, so you're reducing your time-adjusted liability. Maybe you short-sold stock of the defendant. Maybe you have a non-economic ideological reason. You could be an NGO that just is opposed to the business model of the party you're suing. So you have lots of reasons. So this idea of a grief was really sort of pioneered by Vitalik. And the first reference that I'm aware of, at least, where he sort of discusses it in these kinds of terms and uses these words, is in a blog post from 2016 called The Triangle of Harm, where he analyzes griefs on consensus algorithms. He defines this measure of grief that he calls a griefing factor, which is the harm that you do somebody else divided by the cost that you do to yourself. So if and this can be monetary. So for example, it can be harm in euro terms or cryptocurrency terms. I'll have a couple examples at the end that'll be non-monetary. So for example, if I can spend €1 to do €5 of harm to somebody else, that has a griefing factor of 5. So to have a slightly more complicated example, this is a payoff table. So if you're not familiar with sort of game theory and economics literature, the idea is that it tells, we have a 2-player game, so each of Alice and Bob can take 2 actions, where Alice can play U or D, up or down, and Bob can play L or R, left or right. And then, so you have sort of possible outcomes of the game. And in each outcome, you have the payoffs for the 2 players. So for example, if Alice plays U and Bob plays L, then you're in the upper left corner of the table, so that the numbers in that box tell you what each player should be paid. Alice is the first number, Bob's payment is the second number, so UL gives you a payment to Alice of 1 and a payment to Bob of 2. If Alice plays D and Bob plays L, then you're in the lower left, and they both get 0. And a fundamental concept in game theory literature is the notion of equilibrium. Which is a strategy that neither player, if they're rational, would want to deviate from. Neither player regrets. So here, UL is in equilibrium. Because Alice, what can she do? She can play D instead of U, but that takes her payment from 1 to 0. Bob could play R instead of L, but that takes his payment from 2 to 0. So neither player wants to do that if they're rational. But not everybody's rational. So for example, Alice could look at this and be like, wait, why does Bob get 2 and I only get 1? Screw you, Bob! And decides to blow up the negotiation and play D instead of U, even though that cost her something to cost Bob more. And there's psychology research that shows that people actually often think like this. If they think that they're getting a raw deal and somehow a game is unfair, they're willing to take a loss to have sort of what they see as something of a more just outcome. But this is a sort of grief, where here, if compared to like the default of playing UL, and this is kind of an annoying technical point, you always have to consider a grief compared to the default option of doing something else. So there are like 4 different possible outcomes of this game, and we consider one of them to be the default, the equilibrium strategy UL, and all the other sort of griefs are compared to that. But compared to the default of playing UL, Alice's grief of deviating, it costs her 1 and does Bob damage of 2, so it has a griefing factor of 2. Okay, so the term comes from gaming, sort of as you can see defined here. I'm not sure, it might be blurry. But a griefer in multiplayer games is someone who does harm to others without really having a benefit to themselves. If they had a benefit to themselves, it would be called cheating. I'm going to survey a few of the existing thoughts people have had about this idea, and then I'll touch on some of my own research and some of the ways I've been thinking about this. So there's a long traditional economics literature on sabotage. It's a basic concept. It's not like a surprising idea. And economists have analyzed sabotage, but usually it's built into the payoff matrices they consider. So if you consider that sort of like 2x2 matrix I had a couple of slides ago, most economists look at situations like, okay, like I have competitors, they benefit from sabotaging each other, and then I'll construct this game that builds in the sabotage to how the players benefit, to how the players pay off, and then I'll analyze that. And the power of the notion of griefing and griefing factors is you don't have to know how the other side is benefiting from the grief in order to do this analysis. You can say, okay, like this strategy, it has a griefing factor of X. I don't know why anyone would do it, but if they did, this is its griefing factor. And then you can just try to design your game in a way that keeps the griefing factors down without having to predict in advance how others benefit. So there's this flexibility in this idea. So another sort of point of existing research that relates to, again, work that Vitalik did is on the notion of discouragement attacks and relatedly evolutionary stability. So here the idea is you might have a game where if everybody plays normally, honestly, everybody gets some kind of gain. Everybody benefits. But one player can decide to deviate that, imposing a loss on herself, but also imposing a loss on the other players. I'll have an example of this in a couple slides. And then the idea being that the griefer is willing to take a loss so that the other players who were still performing honestly also take losses. And hopefully, at some point, they'll decide to themselves, well, why am I playing this game? I'm doing my best, and I'm taking a loss. And they'll just give up and leave. And the griefer will be left with control of the system. So a specific example is in proof-of-work mining. And there's this preprint paper analyzing griefs in proof-of-work mining by these researchers from the University of London and the Singapore University of Technology and Design, where they prove that, in fact, the equilibria in the game of how much mining power you decide to use, how much hash power you decide to use, is not, like, it has a discouragement attack. It's not, in their words, evolutionary stable. Basically, miners are incentivized to mine a little more than what this sort of cost-benefit analysis of their rewards would tell them to reduce take a larger percentage of the total mining rewards, even though they're spending more electricity, so they have not maximizing their profit, but they take a larger percentage of the rewards. And because they took a larger percentage of the rewards, they reduce the rewards of the other players, which might drive them to a loss and maybe push them out. The people at the Ethereum Foundation have spent a lot of time thinking about grief in the context of like the proof-of-stake consensus algorithm. So in proof-of-stake, there are various actions you can do depending on the tasks assigned to you, if you're a tester or a block producer. And you can fail to do those tasks, which generally produces some kind of grief. And you can see that they've basically designed the system in a way that the griefs aren't too big, no matter which one of these griefing actions you do. And these numbers are based on the sort of real payoffs as of a couple weeks ago. They vary slightly based on the state of the network. Okay, so that's all interesting. But as I said, like, griefs exist in the old world. Why do we talk about them so much in blockchain world? And I have a couple theories for why they're particularly relevant to us. And why this is something that we've innovated and researched on that wasn't necessarily relevant in the past. So first of all, as we sort of already hit on with the litigation example, external incentives can lead someone to do something which looks like a grief if you just consider the internal incentives of the game. And that's very much a thing in in blockchains. You as a mechanism designer can build your protocol and you can say, okay, I've done a good job. Whatever honest strategy I want people to do, UL, it's a dominant strategy, everybody's going to do it. And then you realize that somebody can issue some kind of atomic interaction via transaction, take a flash loan, I don't know, connecting you to a different app, a different DApp that changes the effective payoffs for the participants. Maybe this is maybe you designed like some kind of oracle, and in order to mess with the oracle, you have to take on some fees and take a loss. Nobody would do that, right? But when somebody manipulates your oracle to use it false information on some other platform, they might be able to gain. And here, this payoff example that I had from a couple slides ago, now Alice, what looked like a grief before, is actually some kind of dominant strategy. A second reason why I think this is relevant in crypto economics is that we have particular issues with oracles, continuing on the theme of oracles. In centralized systems, some kind of benevolent dictator can make a subjective judgment that some behavior constitutes a grief or an attack, and they can punish accordingly. In a video game, if I go around griefing people, eventually I might get banned. In that court example, at the end of the case, maybe the judge orders me to pay the legal fees of the other side. In blockchains, this is really hard. It's generally not possible to have this kind of benevolent dictator that comes in at the end and makes everything right. And finally, some people just want to watch the world burn. Trolls are a thing, and maybe we have more of them than other fields. Maybe. Okay, so now I'm going to hit on some things that are more related to my work. So I apologize for the math. I promise there'll be pictures in a second. This looks at how equilibria change when you have griefing players. And the idea is, okay, take the formula that I defined for what a griefing factor was and expand it out a little bit. So like on the top, I have the sum of the harms that I do to the other players, the sum of the difference of their utilities based on my grief. On the denominator, I have the difference in my own utility. And then I'm going to rearrange that. And in the second line, I've rearranged the formula. And then you say, if the player is going to commit a grief, they have to have some reason they did that, even if they're just a pure troll. So they have to get some kind of extra utility. When you think about a broader notion of their utility that's going to encourage them to take on this grief. So I'm going to define another auxiliary utility function that's going to add that in, basically. And in order to be willing to do this grief in equilibrium, they have to get at least enough utility from the grief to take on whatever they lost through the sort of internal utility function. So you define this U prime, which just captures that, basically. So you think of each player having some kind of griefing factor that they're willing to grief at, a lambda I. So like each participant might have different lambda i's depending on how trollish there are. Maybe my lambda I is 5. Some more trolly player would be willing to grief at like a lambda I of like 1. They're willing to do like a worse grief and they still do it. And then you define the UIs in terms of this line at the bottom. That's sort of what gives you people being willing to grief in equilibrium. And what essentially happens is you take the old utility they had, and then you just add in lambda I inverse times the harm they did. So if I could do 2 harm and I have a griefing factor of 5, I took my old utility, and the extra utility I got from the grief is 2 over 5. And another technical point, remember before I said that the base point, the outcome that you're griefing with respect to, the term is important in defining your grief. You can actually get rid of that when you take this perspective of equilibrium. When you look at this payoff formula, utility formula, the term with that in it just cancels out, and you get this other auxiliary utility function, which is the second line. And here, basically, I've taken the perspective that instead of getting pleasure from harming others, I'm annoyed when others do well, which is kind of the same thing. If I look at the example at the bottom, in the upper left, each player gets 1 utility, and I can say, if they weren't trolls, that would be the utility they have. But if they are griefing players, maybe Alice says, oh, I got a utility, but so did Bob, and maybe I don't like Bob, and I want him to do poorly. So I lose a little bit of utility because Bob got utility. Okay, so I'm through the formulas. Sorry about that. Now, at each tuple of lambda i's, each list of trolliness of the different players you have a set of utility functions that defines a game, and as you change those lambda i's, you change the game. And you can consider the equilibria in each version of this game, which gives you a sense of how stable your system is. Like, how much do the equilibria change when you have super trollish players versus not so trollish players? And if the changes are really radical, maybe your game isn't so stable, and maybe you could be just destroyed by an army of trolls. So here in this payoff table abstract example that I had before, you get this picture of, as you vary lambda 1 and lambda 2, you have different regions that you pass through where you have different equilibria behavior. So each time you cross a dotted line, this sort of behavior of your game just radically changes. And this picture might seem a little artificial because I have a two-player game and they're both trolls, they're both griefers. That kind of seems like spy versus spy. But you can take the same perspective where you have n players, k trolls, and you still can do the same thing. You'd have like a k-dimensional space where you can look at the picture of how the behavior of the games change, even though you have n total players in your game. So this gives you a graphical way of looking at the stability of your system. And as an example, back to the proof of work mining example from that paper from the people from the University of London and the Singapore University of Design and Technology, I can extend their work where I look at that game in the same sort of analysis, only now I've varied the griefingness of my players. And you see that the unique equilibrium in that game is this formula here, which determines the hash power and equilibrium of each of the mining players. And this formula is really nice because it's continuous in lambda I. Like ideally, the best case scenario would be that no matter how goofy your players were, that this behavior of your game just never changed. You always got the same equilibrium. But like kind of the next best thing that can happen is that if you have more or less goofing players, your game doesn't change too much. It changes really slowly in a continuous way. And if you look at this, for like all like reasonable lambda i's, the amount of mining that the players do barely changes, unless you have like a lunatic that's willing to grief at really small griefing factors, at which point then their QI changes. So you have this very continuous, very minimal change from the presence of griefing players. You're very resistant to griefs. Okay, so now just sort of hitting briefly on some griefs that cause non-financial harm. So in the Shanghai DOS attacks, the griefer spent gas to perform the attack. And as far as we know, they didn't seem to have any kind of financial benefit from doing this attack. But what they did was they increased the there were different sets of attacks. But generally, they increased the computational load on node operators using different node software. So here, the harm is in computation having to be done, and the cost is in gas. Another situation that we frequently have to think about is delay griefs, where the harm is done in terms of time. So now it's harm in terms of time divided by cost, which might still be monetary. And as an example, in Kleros, again, it's a dispute resolution platform, we have a notion of appeals. Sometimes you can appeal frivolously, similarly to the kind of frivolous litigation in the real world example. So maybe your case starts with 3 jurors, you appeal, and next time there might be 7, 15, 31, doubling plus 1 every time, but the number of jurors roughly doubles. And each time you appeal, you increase the amount of time that it takes to resolve the case by roughly a fixed period. It depends a little bit on what case you're talking about. Maybe it's a week, maybe it's 3 days. But each time you appeal, you get additional appeal period, which is fixed, but the cost of doing the appeal is proportional to the number of jurors. So it's growing exponentially. It's growing as 2 to the n, which means that your griefing factor for appealing n times is n over 2 to the n. So asymptotically, it's not very big. Maybe the first appeal is cheap enough that you're willing to do it. It doesn't cost too much yet because you're only at 7 jurors, but you can still delay it for a week. But as you have more and more appeals, the cost of appealing for a month, for more, is prohibitive, which is not necessarily a kind of asymptotic behavior that you see with the real world frivolous litigation. So asymptotically, as you grow, the griefs aren't too bad. Some other prominent delay griefs, you can have frivolous challenges on curated lists, whether that curated list is using Kleros or some other mechanism. In rollups, specifically in Arbitrum, you can challenge a state update, which starts an interactive game. That interactive game takes some amount of time. That results in a delay. And all of these examples touch on issues with oracles, the sort of broader point I made at the beginning about how our oracles aren't all that great, in that, like, Kleros is a subjective oracle has to do with disputes. What is the right answer to a dispute? Arbitrum, if you sort of squint and think abstractly, when you're doing a state update on L1, you're kind of doing an oracle operation about what's happening on the L2. L1 doesn't know what the right answer to a dispute is. It doesn't know what the right state of L2 is until you tell it that information. And this process of telling it that information might be subject to delay griefs. That is one trade-off you can make when you're designing that game. Okay, so just to conclude, griefs can be results of hidden motives, or they might just be the results of trolling. This is particularly relevant for the interconnected world of blockchains because of external motivations. Griefing factor approach allows you to abstract away what those external motivations are and just try to optimize for your griefs. And thinking about the variation in terms of this like geometry diagram that I showed can give you a global sense of whether your system is stable to different levels of griefing. It's possible that your griefs might be explicit. Maybe sometimes they're the unintended results of like how much some operation costs in gas or something that you didn't intend when you created the design of your game. They can be financial or involve time or some other resource. And what you really care about is them not being too bad as you have sort of whales and larger players that could do real harm. Okay, so thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions if there's time.
Thank you very much. So I'm ready to take questions.
Could you explain the logic behind lambda inverse in your equation?
Yeah, like why is it an inverse versus like a lambda, or?
No, I got the lambda in the last equation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, could you explain? I couldn't get that part. I got the equation, but not the lambda inverse part.
Yeah, so the lambda is, I replaced the GF thing. The idea is that I define a griefing factor in terms of this thing in the first line. In the second line, I've rearranged the first line. And in the third line, I take this perspective that each player has some griefing factor that they're willing to grief at now. So I assign to each player a lambda that is their level of griefiness. So you'll notice that it just like replaces the GF.
Yeah, okay. I got that. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
So is it possible, right now we define harm and gain in scalar values. Is it possible that the values of the attacker and the attacked may be a little bit more complex, or maybe valued at different, from different perspectives in a different way? Is there a way to account that in those equilibria formulas too?
Yeah, so I mean, in order to do this kind of analysis with the pictures, you need to have some payoff table for how you think people or what utility they get from playing the game. It doesn't have to necessarily be like constant values like this. They can have like a continuum of different values for like infinitely different many outcomes of the game. But you have to be able to assign some utility to each player and each outcome.
Right, seems fair. So alternatively, we probably could just add multiple units there, right? That you just don't get paid in one unit, but like in 3 different units, I guess.
Yeah, you know, you could, if people have sort of complex motivations, you need some way to like smash them together into a utility function.
All right, seems fair.
Oh yeah.
Is there any research on bribing on the DeFi ecosystem, the token bribes? Do they become griefing?
On bribing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so some of our other research is like related to special kinds of bribes in Kleros, because another thing you might try to do is try to bribe the jurors. There are specifically very interesting bribes called P+epsilon attacks that we published a paper on recently. This is again based on like a blog post of Vitalik where he sort of introduced this attack back in the day on a system that was like a predecessor influencer of Kleros. Of course, there's research on bribing in the economics literature more generally. So yes, there's research on bribing. The kind of line where a bribe becomes a grief, or where like an attack becomes a grief, is where you don't know what utility the attacker is getting from doing the attack. So with a bribe, maybe you can have this perspective of having a specific outcome that they're trying to get, that you know the utility of that, and you can do like maybe a richer analysis of the game because you have this extra information about what their goal is.